Good evening. My name is Walter Locke. I'm the ACMI member producer of this evening's program, Turning Fear into Power, One Woman's Journey Confronting the War on Terror. That is also the name of a book written by a woman whom you're about to meet, who spent some time during the past decade in 7 war-torn countries that became, as she puts it now, a story of the development of my personal sense of empowerment in the face of violent forces that had always appeared to be beyond my reach. Before meeting the book's author, I wish to say something first about the enormous value of having here in Arlington, where I have lived for more than 30 years, a communications resource like Arlington Community Media Inc., ACMI. Electronic media dominates our culture and shapes it, but most of us have no way of using it to put in our own 2 cents worth. ACMI gives Arlington citizens the chance to do so. The high-quality equipment in this studio and in the control room behind our studio audience is very expensive. Colleges and universities that can provide access to such equipment and instruction in its use are also expensive. Here, knowledge, training, and access to the equipment are provided for an annual membership fee equaling the cost of dinner and a show for 2. As a member and former employee, I thank ACMI, its executive director, its board, and its staff for delivering this opportunity to an eager and talented community of members here in our town. They make tonight's program, and many, many others, possible. Well, this evening I am joined now by the author from Northern California of Turning Fear into Power. Linda, it's so great to have you here. Linda Sartor, there's the book. So, welcome, Linda, and let me start by saying it's been a pleasure to welcome you to Arlington. Last night we had a chance to see your slideshow, and here's the book, which I want people to realize is available through Amazon.com or
go to your local bookstore, locally owned bookstore, and ask them to order it.
That's it. Let's do it that way, folks. Go to your local bookstore and ask them for this fabulous book, Turning Fear into Power.
And include either my name, Linda Sartor, or the subtitle, One Woman's Journey Confronting the War on Terror, because unfortunately there's another book by the same title.
I know, and I found it when I just thought I could get away with the shortcut of looking just for Turning Fear into Power. Anyway, we had a chance to share with some of the local people in this community your slideshow, and I was quite moved by it, and I just wanted to ask you the obvious first question, which I think is, how did you first come to the idea or the notion of taking this odyssey to 7 countries who were at war and visiting there alone as a single woman on her own?
Yeah, so it wasn't like a decision I made that I was going to go to 7 war-torn countries in the next decade. But following 9/11, my heart was tormented by the way that the U.S. responded to that.
Yeah.
And I had all my life I'd been a peace activist and a educator, and so that wasn't enough anymore. I had so much energy going through. My heart was saying, "You've got to go, put your body in places, and let people know that my life as a U.S. American citizen isn't any more precious than anybody else's lives."
Right.
And so I was just open to hearing where I might be able to go do that. And the first thing I heard about was happening in Israel-Palestine. I mean, we heard about the bombing in Afghanistan. That was one of the first things that happened after 9/11. But the thing that I was able to think about joining was the international solidarity movement in Israel-Palestine. And at that time, in the spring of 2002, it was a very volatile, very brutal time there. A lot was happening, and that's when it was in the news. I heard about the international solidarity movement through my friend who probably would have liked to have gone herself, but because of her life circumstances, wasn't able to. So she was telling me about it, knowing something about about my feelings, and really encouraging me and supporting me. Having her support made a big difference in the whole process of getting there and being there.
So what was it about what was happening then in Palestine? And actually you were there in 2002, but What was it about it that made you say to yourself, well, this seems kind of dangerous and crazy, but I'm going to do it anyway because what?
Yeah, and again, it wasn't one thing, but it was this tormented heart that was calling me to do something, to get into some sort of action like that. And once I heard about and saw the possibility of going to Israel, Palestine, my heart was like relentless, even when, as I prepared and as I thought about what I was doing, and fears showed up and good reasons showed up to talk myself out of going, that my heart was relentless and wouldn't let me say, just, it was saying, it doesn't matter how scared you are or what might happen, this is something you've got to do.
So your reaction to the 9/11 event was, how did you feel about the U.S. response to that? You mentioned it as the reason for coming to this decision.
Right, because I, as a peace activist, so much of my life, I was actually getting hopeful with the breakdown of the Iron Curtain, the ending of the Cold War, the moratorium on testing nuclear weapons. Those were all little indications to me that we actually were getting potentially beyond war. And then all of a sudden, it was like an immediate response of the nation and so many people and the media. It was like backtracking, and that was quite upsetting to me.
Upsetting. Now, when you decided that you would go and go to Israel and Palestine, what were you most concerned about or worried about or fearful of before you went?
Yeah, actually, you know what I'd like to do is talk a bit about how I worked with my fear, even before I started really looking at the specifics.
Excellent.
One of the things I do in my life is I guide wilderness trips where people go out and do a 3-day fast alone in the desert. That's one of my jobs, is to support people in that process. And I've done that myself enough times. But the witnessing of people preparing for 3 days, then going out for 3 days and 3 nights, and then coming back, and we work with them for another 3 days to bring what they got out of that experience back into their lives. But in that first part, that preparation, it's not supposed to be about survival. It's really supposed to be about being in relationship and getting into closer relationship with oneself through the experience in the desert. And people's fears show up. People are afraid. Several of the fears are mountain lions, rattlesnakes, the dark, being alone. And so I work with people in preparation for this experience that their heart is calling them to do, that actually helps them get more in touch with what their heart is calling them to do in the world. Mm-hmm. We work through those fears, and I have had a lot of experience doing that. So here it is, after witnessing people getting more in touch with their own heart's calling, my heart, I couldn't not hear what my heart was telling me. And so the fears, of course, I was going alone. I was meeting up with a group, but I wasn't like clear who I was going to be meeting up with, where I was going to be meeting them, how anything was going to happen. I had email contact with a couple people in the International Solidarity Movement in Palestine, and then after I got my ticket, they were on tour in the U.S. doing a speaking tour, so they weren't even going to be there when I arrived, and that was one thing that showed up, like, that made me feel a little insecure. The fact that they had originally said, come anytime, we need you anytime, and I made my reservations, then I heard, after I made my reservations, it would be better if you came in July. I was going in May and June, and that was because they were, at that point, planning a more more of a program where they were going to be doing a whole training, and a bunch of people were going to be coming, and that just felt a little bit more structured and a little bit more secure. But here I had my ticket, and I was committed to going, and so the fears of what might happen. Here I am going into a war zone. I didn't know what to expect. I did clarify my own thinking about my own possibility of dying, and realized that this is important to me, and I am willing to risk my life for justice, for people who are affected by my taxpayer dollars supporting something that's going on that is totally not okay. Yeah. So So
good
did
on
I
you.
answer your question?
You did, and good on you
about
for,
some of the fears that showed up.
and good on you for taking the stand. It's a noble thing in my mind for you to have done that, especially given that you were going to be alone as a woman in a Muslim culture, or and you didn't know the language. You didn't speak a word of Arabic, as far as I know. There are customs, or Hebrew. There are customs there that can make a big difference, like clothing and covering certain parts of your body, like the head in particular. So there were things that you were going to be kind of winging it. So I expect you might have been a little nervous. Once you were there, what happened, or what particular? Maybe you could give a couple of examples of particularly scary moments in Israel, Palestine.
Yes. So when I first got there and arrived in East Jerusalem, started meeting some of the teammates that I was going to be spending some time with. We were going to have some training, but the day of our training, our leaders heard about the things that were happening already or that were happening that day in Balata camp, and made a decision that we needed to go and be there.
Now, Balata
camp is a refugee camp, but it's not really like when you picture it. When I picture a refugee camp, I picture tents.
Right.
But this is a refugee camp that's been in place since '48, so for generations, and it's really a village. It's a town. There's houses, beautiful houses actually. Not tents that people are living in there. So, but that's the name of the place where the Israeli soldiers had gone in that day and arrested all the men, detained some of the men, and told the rest of them they couldn't go back to their homes until the soldiers had completed their orders in Balata camp, and they were going to be searching some houses. And what we learned later was they were actually bashing through the walls of the homes. So there's homes that are on a street that are all sharing walls with each other.
Right.
And the soldiers' orders were to go enter the homes, bash holes through the walls, spray paint arrows to show the pathway through the Palestinian homes so that they didn't have to pass on the street where they were more vulnerable to snipers.
Right.
So we didn't know that when we heard that the soldiers had gone into Balata camp and arrested all the men. But we realized that we needed to go. And part of our reason for being there was to witness.
Yeah.
And part of it was to accompany people. So when we were on our way through Nablus, there were 11 of us walking. So we got a taxi as far as we could get before there was a roadblock. Then we walked in the rest of the way through into Nablus. 5 of us went over to the hospital where there was a need for internationals. And then 11 of us were on our way into Balata camp. It was actually getting towards night, and it's dangerous to be out in Palestine after dark because there was a curfew. And the only thing that really, it wasn't because there was a curfew that we as internationals couldn't be out, but after dark they couldn't see that we were internationals, so we didn't have that protection.
I see.
So we needed to get into Balata camp and into people's homes as quickly as possible. We were walking along to enter Balata camp, and ambulances, Palestinian ambulances, were the only vehicles that were allowed out on the streets during curfew. Well, the only Palestinian vehicles that were allowed out. So there was an ambulance that went past us, and soon after the ambulance passed us, there was a line of like machine gun fire that was hitting the street in front of them and in front of us from a tank that was guarding the entrance to the Balata camp.
And we're going to hear the rest of this story as soon as we come back after this break.
Community media, from my point of view, is organic.
It's power.
Public access to me gives me an opportunity to get my word out to the larger community of the town that I can't get to on my own.
This is good programming. This is what people say, well, how come they don't ever write anything good in the news, right? This is the good news.
What we're doing is critical, it's important. We have to stay energized and motivated to do this work in our community, but understand that our real mission is to hold up our part as we encourage others to hold up their part around the planet.
Welcome back. Again, I'm Walter Locke at ACMI Studio A, Arlington Community Media, and we're very happily engaged in a discussion of this book by Linda Sartor, Turning Fear into Power, One Woman's Experience, One Woman's Journey Confronting the War on Terror. Linda is here with me. She's begun her story, and we left it for our break in the middle of a rather dramatic telling of these events in Balata camp in Palestine. So why don't we go back there, and while you're at it, frame this whole story by saying exactly where you went, which countries you went to over which period of time. I think you started in 2002 and you went all the way to 2012.
That's right, yes. So it was, like I said before, it wasn't that I planned my trips ahead. It's that different opportunities and callings and needs showed up in the decade following 9/11. And I ended up going to 7 different countries. Israel, Palestine were 2 of those countries. And then from there I ended up going to Iraq. And I was there the month before we started bombing. I was there in early February and coming home on February 15th. And then I was in Sri Lanka with an organization called the Nonviolent Peace Force, that organization was trying to bring down to earth a vision that Gandhi had to have a peace team or a peace army of civilians from all over the world who are unarmed, and just the presence of outsiders in place of violent conflict can change the dynamics so that it opens up the political space for local people to do their peace building and peacekeeping work in their own way, but just having the outsiders present can open up the space for them to do that. So that we were learning what that meant in a real situation, and I was in the pilot project in Sri Lanka. From there, so I was going and coming for 4 years there, and ended up living there for 2 years total over that 4-year period. Then in 2008, I was in Iran. Bush was talking at that point about invading Iran. I went there with Global Exchange as a citizen diplomat. A couple of years went by because Obama came into office. There wasn't so much of a call. And then I had the opportunity to go to Afghanistan and did that. And then that was 2011. I was thinking, okay, I had already started writing the book by that point, didn't know where the book was going to end, decided, that's a good place, because we started by bombing Afghanistan in shortly after 9/11. So by making my trip there at the end of the decade, that seemed like a good ending. But then shortly after that, I was called to Bahrain, and so I couldn't not include that, and so I added that to the afterthoughts in the book. So that's the 7 places where I spent time in the decade following 9/11.
But your experience in Camp Balata, is it?
Balata camp, yes.
Balata
so
camp
back to that story.
is sort of a prequel to what you learned in Sri Lanka about the importance and the difference it makes to have citizen diplomats or whatever.
People present,
workers.
Outsiders present that are just witnessing and accompanying the local people who are likely to have violent conflict.
Right. So you were actually in one of these houses because you were a woman, and they said the men couldn't be there. You were in the house, and the soldiers didn't actually come then, but when they did come, they were doing things like crashing holes in the wall so they could pass from one dwelling to another without being seen on the street.
Yeah,
and then you were telling this one story.
I was telling the story before we even got into a house, when we were just coming into the camp.
Oh, right.
And that was with the machine gun fire on the street in front of us. So the ambulance turned around and actually picked us up, and we were all able to fit. They drove us around to another entry into Balata camp where there was another tank, and dropped us off. Didn't even notice what they did, but we then had to get past this tank after we'd had that other experience. So in order to get into anybody's house to be safe for the night, and it was dusk at this point. So we just clumped together, raised our hands, and walked past the tank and nobody came out of the tank. So we managed to get in, and we were welcomed into people's houses. And then it wasn't until the next morning when we started to learn what the orders of the soldiers was, when we actually saw them entering houses and breaking through the walls. And so we were just in the houses with the people as this process was taking place.
And those
Until there
people
was an
actually
injury.
wanted you there because you were, in a sense, sort of a protection.
Right, exactly. So yeah, the people were very happy to have us come stay with them and be in their houses with them while this was taking place. Right. Yeah.
So after Camp Balata, how long were you there?
So Balata Camp was 4 days while the soldiers were doing their activities. And it was a big 4 days in my life because there was a lot of different things we were doing and witnessing. It's hard for me to decide which pieces to talk about, but we were accompanying women and children because the only way they were allowed out of the houses during curfew was to go to the clinic. And oftentimes they wanted our accompaniment as they walked past the soldiers to get to the clinic. But also there were men coming and going. Even though they weren't allowed to stay in their homes, they were, for some reason, coming and going to some extent. And sometimes we were asked to accompany men as they walked past the soldiers. So there was this one time when we had finished accompanying women and children on a far part of the camp, and a family asked us to accompany 3 men to go back out to the mosque where they were staying outside the camp. And so we were doing that, and they were getting stopped at every corner by armed soldiers and having their ID checked. And at one point, one of the men that we were walking with just said, why? And then shortly after that, they got stopped again, and this time the soldiers had them put their arms up against the wall. And then any Palestinian men that went by, they were told to do the same until there was about 20 Palestinian men lined up on the wall with their hands up, and these 2 armed soldiers just guarding them. And I was just standing like in between, really paying attention. So if a soldier went over to talk to a Palestinian man, I went over, and just to be really obviously, I'm paying attention to what you're doing. Yeah. And I didn't understand what was being said, but there were 2 of us. My buddy was watching from the side, while I was just kind of hanging out in the middle there, and it just. Shortly after that, a whole crew of Israeli soldiers came down the street, and at the same time, I had a phone call from a radio station back here in the U.S. that I was being interviewed about what I was witnessing in Israel Palestine. And so then after I hung up the phone, one of the soldiers looked at me and he said, "Go home," and I just looked back at him and I said, "No," and he said, "Well, what's the matter with you? Don't you speak English? Go home." And again, I said no. And it was like he didn't know how to respond. It wasn't part of their training to know how to deal with internationals that were just kind of coming and getting in the way of things.
And saying no.
So he just turned around and walked away. So it was quite a powerful feeling.
And you overheard him later saying something to one of the other soldiers?
Yeah, that wasn't that one.
Oh.
No, while we were in the houses when the walls were being bashed, there was one soldier that spoke English, and he looked at me at one point and he said, why are you here? And I said, because I disagree with because my government or my country is supporting what you're doing, and I disagree with that. And the woman that I was with in the house heard him go back when he went back to talk to the others in Hebrew. She understood Hebrew, and he was saying, "She's crazy, she's disobeying her government." And that told me a lot about how it is, a difference in how we see our government. To me, I was being a good citizen of a democracy, of a true democracy, by speaking up and acting when what my government's doing is not okay. But for them, it was a different way of viewing that.
So when did you get home from this trip to to Israel and Palestine. When did you return
Yeah, I
home?
came back in June, early June of 2002.
And so what kinds of things occurred to you after you returned? I mean, you know, things kind of percolate and settle down, and then you
Yeah,
have
so
revelations about it later.
One of the things that I had done in preparation for going is I had gone to listen to somebody who had gone and joined up with ISM earlier, like in March and April. And he'd had quite traumatic experiences while he was there. Came back and he actually felt like he had some post-traumatic stress. So when, in my preparations for going, I thought that might be a possibility, and I made some arrangements in case I needed to have counseling when I got back. I was prepared for that. But instead, what happened, I noticed in July when I was back out in the wilderness guiding a trip, and you know, all of our participants were out in their places, and two of us were back in base camp, and I had some time just to reflect on myself. I noticed that I felt more alive than I had felt ever in my life. And so that was quite a contrast to having post-traumatic stress. And what I realized when I reflected on that was, yeah, you know, all of my life I've been witnessing violence in the background of my life always. You know, it's on the news all the time. And it's something that's never been okay, but I've never felt like there was anything I could do to change that. You know, so it was a kind of a hopeless, helpless feeling. And just that little bit of getting in the way when the when the Palestinian men were lined up on the wall and the soldiers were all kind of swarming around, and I was on the phone talking to the media back here about what was going on. It just gave me a sense of it gave me my life back in a big way. You know, it gave me my aliveness back.
Wow, and so all of a sudden, mountain lions and rattlesnakes weren't the most terrible thing.
Yeah, well, for me, mountain lions and rattlesnakes weren't the issue, because I actually live in a place where they live as well, and I've learned to cohabitate with mountain lions and rattlesnakes and not need to feel afraid. But going into a war zone alone, and just traveling. I wasn't somebody who enjoyed traveling. So the kinds of things that happen when one opens to listening to their heart and not letting, and getting in relationship with fear in a different way so that it doesn't stop you, you really don't know where that's going to lead. So when I was back home, and you know, Bush was talking about bombing Iraq, and we didn't know when it was going to happen. And I was seeing on emails different delegations that were going to Iraq to join up with an organization called Iraq Peace Teams. I was feeling, okay, it wasn't as clear, that heart wasn't as strongly saying you've got to do this, but I was thinking about going to Iraq. And then when a 2-week period opened up that worked in my schedule, and they were looking for this delegation, they were looking for only people who had experience in a war zone, had some experience in a war zone. So my little time in Palestine was enough. So I got accepted in this delegation that went off in early February. The reason they wanted people who had some experience, because we didn't know when the bombing was going to start. So,
well, we're going to get to Iraq in our next segment and questions from the audience. But I just want to say it's striking to me to feel more alive than you've ever felt when you're in a situation of what I would imagine is terrifying, and I would feel like I would be cowering in a corner, not feeling most alive I ever have, except I've heard that said many times by Vietnam veterans and other veterans, that in the heat of fire they feel very alive, because it's very clear that they're on the precipice of being alive or not alive. We'll be right back in a few more seconds with our guest, Linda Sartor, talking about her book, Turning Fear into Power. I'm too afraid now to say it right. We'll see you just in another minute. Thanks.
Common household hazardous wastes range from cleaners and photography chemicals to paint products and automotive materials. The Minuteman Hazardous Household Products Facility offers 8 opportunities a year for residents to safely dispose of these hazardous materials. The facility is designed to accept general household chemicals, bath products, laundry materials, kitchen materials, lawn and garden products, and automotive products. Collection events begin at 9 a.m. Signs and orange cones will help keep you headed towards the registration area. Wait times may vary from 15 minutes to a half hour. April and November events tend to be the most crowded. Visitors will be asked to show proof of residency. Some communities require pre-registration.
Hey guys,
Oh, hey Studio Night.
want to do something cool? Make TV with ACMI Studio Nights.
I don't think we have time to make TV.
That sounds hard.
You have time to watch TV, but not to make TV?
Well,
Join ACMI Studio Nights to make TV with new friends, Wednesdays from 7 to 9 p.m. and get this tiny flashlight, unless you're scared.
I'm not scared. You know we can still see you, right?
No, you can't.
Pretty sure we still can.
Do you have what it takes to ride with the Studio Nights? Of course you do. Join us next Wednesday.
Welcome back to Studio Nights. We are producing this program for you here in Arlington, Massachusetts, and we are with the author of this book. So she's with us here, and she's ready to answer questions by the audience, if there are any. And I'm going to invite whoever might want to pose a question to come right up right now. And you give them the answers.
Hi, Linda. I'm just curious to know what kind of clearance you needed to get from the U.S. government, if any, and how you went about getting that.
Yeah, so for each country it was different, but the one that I'm thinking is maybe most interesting was going to Iraq. It was during the time of the sanctions. It was before the bombing, and it was illegal to fly into Iraq. So the group that I went with was Iraq peace teams, and Christian peacemaker teams was the delegation who I went with. They organized the trip, and we had to get passports. So I had just been to Israel, Palestine, and I had an Israel stamp in my passport, which you can't get into an Arab country. It wasn't the U.S., it was the Arab country that wouldn't let me in with the Israeli stamp on my passport. So I had to get a second temporary passport so that I had one that didn't have an Israeli stamp. So that was that. But for the U.S. government, we flew, the group flew into Jordan, and then we had a bus transport us across the land into Baghdad. It was coming back that we were kind of wondering what would happen coming back into the country. It was so funny because when the inspector looked at my passport and asked me what I'd been doing, I told him the truth. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something that I was in Iraq, and I had no idea what. I've done civil disobedience, so I was ready for that. And he just said, "Good for you," and he handed me back my passport. So it really depends on who you're talking to, how they decide to respond.
I see. And second part of the question is, did you have an overall plan when you started out as to how many countries you would visit and how long it would take, or was it an impromptu plan that developed?
It was impromptu. Each time I made plans, when I found out about a place that I was being called to, then I would make the plans for that place. But from one trip to the next, I didn't know ahead. I didn't plan ahead. It was, I heard about the International Solidarity Movement, made my arrangements, ended up there, came back, started thinking about going to Iraq, found a delegation that I joined, did the planning for that, came back. Heard in the process when I was preparing to go to Palestine, it was when I first heard about the Nonviolent Peace Force. Okay. They weren't ready to get into action yet, and I was. So by the time I came back from Iraq, they were in the process of hiring for the pilot project in Sri Lanka.
So each time it sounds like you had a delegation or an organization that you were part of. You did not just go as an individual.
Exactly.
Okay.
Every time I had a group
Okay.
that I was going with, but the traveling alone part really was getting to meet up with the group.
Those organizations,
like
got it.
Going to Afghanistan the first time, I had to get into Afghanistan before I joined my group. So those were sometimes the most challenging parts for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And you mentioned ISM, and I was
I'm
curious.
sorry, yeah.
I was curious when your visit when was it relative to the American woman who was killed there?
Yes, so
Rachel Corrie.
when I was preparing to go to Palestine, and when I was in Palestine, it gave me I had a sense of protection that turned out to be illusionary, because I felt like, okay, as a U.S. American citizen, it would be bad PR for an Israeli soldier to hurt a U.S. American, because we're supporting them financially in what they're doing. And that turned out not to be true, because just like a year or two after I was there was when Rachel Corrie, and a lot of people have heard that story, but she was there with the International Solidarity Movement, and she put herself in front of a bulldozer and got killed by the bulldozer driver. And so it wasn't true that there was this. I wouldn't have been as bold as I had been if that story, I might not have even gone to Palestine if I had heard that story before going.
Hi, Linda. My name is George, and I'm wondering what kind of power you mean when you say turning fear into power.
Ah, good question. So I believe that the whole war on terror, that the people in power in the world are using fear to stay in power. And that I also believe that the more each one of us follows our heart, and it's not doing what I did, it's like doing what your heart is calling you to do, that for each one of us, the more of us that are able to do that, to follow our heart and be with fear in a different way, it's not getting rid of fear, but being with it in a different way, the better off our world will be. And then it's a way of reclaiming our power as citizens in a democracy.
And do you see that translating into some kind of political power to confront the war on terror, which, as you know, continues?
Right. I think there's not one way to confront the war on terror, and I think that getting into relationship with fear and getting into a different kind of relationship with fear is one way to confront the war on terror. Because to me, the war on terror is just largely about building up fears in the population in order to stay for various different political entities to stay in power. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
George, I happen to know that you did some similar kind of activist peacekeeping work in Iraq. Would you like to share just a bit of that with Linda?
Yeah, I had been going to Iraq since 1997, numerous trips, and with different delegations. And I was there actually as part of the peace team, but I had to leave in January. Yeah, so.
So we didn't cross paths, but we were in the same place with the same people, with some of the same people.
Yes.
Thanks for doing that.
Okay, so anybody else feel called to ask a question? Come up if you do. Thank you. I happen to know this is Marie. Marie, this is Linda.
Hi, Linda. I'm Marie. I live in Arlington. George kind of took my question, but another one I had is, as a former educator and concerned with the education of our youth, I'm thinking of all these instances of fear and power that you've just shared with us in this brief time tonight. Think back in terms of your own growing up and what things kind of brought you to the point where you were able to overcome all of those obstacles to make those decisions to face a lot of those very dangerous situations. And what can we do with our children, our grandchildren, in our education system to try and promote that kind of thinking in terms of being good citizens and doing things that are hard?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I did talk. I think that my experiences with working with people in the wilderness really was more than any of my childhood experiences. But I was an educator, and I did teach 6th grade and 7th grade and 2nd grade for a decade in my life, for 10 years. And I used consensus decision-making process in my classroom for how I managed my classroom. And I found that was really empowering to my students, because they were needing to take responsibility for their environment, and they were learning to speak and learning to listen. And it was a real practical, I mean, it wasn't the reason that I did that. I was, again, called to do that because I was an environmental educator, and I learned by being involved in the consensus process myself that I found my voice and I had something to say and contribute, and it was a contribution to a group to speak up. So I used consensus decision making in my classroom as a method towards environmental education, but it turned out to be a powerful way of getting my students thinking, really thinking, and learning to speak what they had to contribute. And I also used to get arrested at the Nevada test site protesting nuclear moratorium, that we were still paying for the testing of nuclear weapons. And it would be, I would drive through the night on Friday night, get arrested on Saturday, drive home on Sunday. So I didn't miss any school. And after doing that 3 times, 3 years in a row, I decided I should make this more public. The reason I'm doing this is to raise people's awareness. So I got a newspaper reporter. He said, bring some black and white photos. So there was a line in the newspaper that said, Windsor teacher arrested. And the superintendent called me into the office after that and asked me about it. But, I hadn't done anything wrong. Again, from my perspective, I was standing up for democracy. But my students, after I left the middle school, I had 6th graders who were then in 8th grade, and the whole 8th grade class organized a protest when the school board voted to pay themselves a stipend, and the kids were still reading 10-year-old textbooks. And most of the whole 8th grade class walked out during announcements and did a nonviolent protest. And I wasn't even at the school any longer. It was like, yeah. So, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes,
It
well,
was
it was very good
a bit of a tangent.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
If you live in one of the 22 communities that appear on your screen now, you likely belong to the Mystic River watershed. This vital resource is a natural living system that we all share. Since 1972, the Mystic River Watershed Association has successfully fought to protect and restore this treasure. Now I'm asking you to join that effort. Please go to mysticriver.org to become a member and to find out how you can help today.
Fact, you can recycle this number 6 cup for curbside pickup in Arlington, but not this number 6 plastic foam. But now you can recycle number 6 plastic foam at Arlington's Community Collection Day. Fact, they also take electronics, sharps, batteries, metal items, bicycles, clothing good enough for resale, TV or computer monitors with picture tube CRTs for only $10, normally $40 if they pick one up at the curb, propane cylinders, and returnable bottles and cans to benefit the high school students' SAVE Environmental Action Program. Fact, it's open from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. only. Fact, it's at the Arlington Town Yard, 51 Grove Street.
Fact, it's on May 10th, so start saving your number 6 foam right now.
Fact, I'm Glenn Koenig and I approve this message. Facts in this video have been verified with the Public Works Department of the Town of Arlington. For more information, call 781-316-3108 or see the town's website.
Welcome back. As you know, we're here in the studio at ACMI, Arlington Community Media, with author Linda Sartor. Turning Fear into Power is her book, and the subtitle, One Woman's Journey Confronting the War on Terror. So we're going to ask you a little bit later about how people can get this book and how they can find other resources that may be useful if they feel moved to get involved in somewhat the way you have, or in their own way. They may have their own projects locally that they're interested in being active about. So we do want to ask you about that. First, I want to see if we can finish the journey, the Odyssey, which included 7 countries, but we have spoken not so much about either Bahrain or Sri Lanka. So if you have a story from either or both of those areas, it would be fun. It's not probably the right word, but it'd be good to hear them. So let's think about, I know you were in Sri Lanka for quite a long time. That might be a place where you have stories.
Okay, so yeah, there's lots of stories that took place in Sri Lanka. And the situation there was quite complex. So it's difficult to tell brief stories. I think maybe talking about Bahrain would be easier, would be better in a short time. Bahrain is a tiny island off the coast of Saudi Arabia, where they had their Arab Spring uprising starting February 14th, 2011, and they were treated brutally during the Arab Spring uprising, yet the people standing up for their democratic rights were out on the streets every day for that year. And this was the 1-year anniversary, and continuing to be treated brutally by a cruel monarchy that was being supported by the U.S. And we were asked, a human rights activist in Bahrain contacted some of the different organizers of some of the groups that I had been part of, Voices for Creative Nonviolence, Code Pink, and ISM, the International Solidarity Movement, were all asked, and a few of us were able to get into the country. Just getting into that country was difficult. If they could see that we were a human rights activist or a journalist, they were turning people away. So I had to disguise myself as a rich tourist, part of a couple. And I met this guy from Voices for Creative Nonviolence at the Washington, D.C. airport, and we went in together as if we were a couple. And we did manage to get in. But there were some of us who didn't manage to get in to Bahrain. We managed to stay there for 4 days before we were deported. And we managed to stay there until February 14th, 2012, the anniversary of their, and the people did think that that our presence did make a difference in terms of the amount of brutality that took place wherever we were present. But it was large demonstrations, and they were using tear gas produced by the U.S. As punishment. And that was the first time I've ever experienced tear gas. One of my little story that I love to tell is that the Bahraini people, even though we were there to support them, when we were being attacked by tear gas and everybody was running, and I had lost my street buddy, this man was just, come on, come on, come on. You know, a stranger, a Bahraini man was just saying, come on, come on. And then he flagged down a car that had 3 women in it, and there was room for me, and got me into the car, and they drove me out away from the tear gas. And I learned later that others in my delegation, a car stopped and people got out of the car for them to get in to get out. Yeah. So even though we were there supposedly to support them and to provide somewhat of a protective presence, they were really taking care of us in a big way.
So what is next for you now? You're doing tours to talk about the book. You're still offering workshops in Northern California and vision quests out on the desert there. Just tell us a little bit more about that ongoing work that you...
Yeah, actually, I am doing book talks and am available to do that if my expenses can be covered, if I'm not doing it in the Northern California Bay Area.
Right.
I also have done twice, I've done workshops on turning fear into power, on really working with people on getting in touch with some heart calling and some fear that might be getting in the way of that, and working with people in the same way that I work with people who are dealing with fears when they're on their way out to do the 3 days and 3 nights in the desert. So I'm available to do workshops on that topic, turning fear into power.
Can you tell us anything about the actual process or mechanism of doing that work during the 3 days of preparation and then the 3 days out and the 3 days of post soloing? Just something that could help us understand, well, I know what fear is because I have it about X, Y, or Z, but how do I turn that into power as opposed to...
Well, so often we think the way to deal with fear is to get rid of it which means oftentimes means denying it,
Mhm.
and then it has power, complete power over us without us having any way to work with it, because
Right.
we're
It's something to
because
be avoided, yeah.
yeah, so it's going to be there. We're all going to have fear, and fear is good, but not when, but there's fear also. It's in our imaginations, largely in our imaginations, and it's contagious. And so there's a lot about fear that isn't about survival, and so it's like getting into a relationship with fear, even embracing fear, as opposed to denying it and trying to get rid of it and saying I don't have it. So it's recognizing fear when it shows up and then learning from it. It's like, okay, so what does it have to teach me? You know, some of the work that I did in preparation for going to Palestine was like, I thought about, okay, what is it that I'm afraid of? And if I were in that situation, what would I do? Who do I need to talk to find out what the resources are or what they would do? Or, you know, it's just like being with the fear rather than just saying, well, I'm not afraid and I'm just going to go and do it anyway. That's dangerous. You know, but being with fear in a different way is empowering.
How do you help people get grounded before taking on something scary to them?
Grounding is really imagining roots growing down from my feet down into the ground and really rooting me into the earth is a way to just stay grounded. And yeah, and there's a way to stand where you're more solid than you're not so easily knocked off balance. When that's did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for. Well, thank you so much for this evening and for this program. I think it'll be of interest to many, many people. Those who are watching at home, we hope that you will do some looking into this. You can go online and find this book, Turning Fear into Power. And you can also, and by the way, if you just do Turning Fear into Power, you'll find more than one book. So add One Woman's Journey Confronting the War on Terror. Also, you can Google or you can find peace activist groups that are going to some of these places, or you can find local community groups that are doing peace activism of one sort or another. And we encourage you to do that and to get in touch with your own community groups.
There are groups, and maybe we can add them to the program.
Yeah.
So the names of the groups that I'm aware of,
Right.
like Global Exchange was who I went to Iran with, and the Nonviolent Peace Force, and International Solidarity Movement, and there's also Peace Brigades International and Christian Peacemaker teams and Michigan Peace teams that do similar work to the Nonviolent Peace Force, peacekeeping work, unarmed civilian.
Well, that'll be good. We will add those to the end of the program in what we call post-production. So for now, I'd just like to ask you if you would be willing to read something I found in your book, which is an inspiring quote, and I'll ask you to read it.
Yeah, so this is actually not my words, but it was the words of Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and it was in an email message that I received, and I was inspired by these words, so I sent them out to my email list, because they really do express what I'd like people to be getting from what I have to say in the book and in my stories that I tell. She says, ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach. Any small, calm thing that one soul can do to help another soul, to assist some portion of this poor suffering world, will help immensely. It's not given to us to know which acts or by whom will cause the critical mass to tip toward the enduring good. What is needed for dramatic change is an accumulation of acts, adding to, adding more, continuing. We know that it does not take everyone on earth to bring justice and peace, but only a small determined group who will not give up during the first, second, or 100th gale.
And many people seem to be feeling now, I hear it a lot, and I feel it myself quite a bit, that we have been sort of incrementally moving in that direction and more aware of peace and justice issues as a planet, as a country, and also as a planet, and that that in the seeking that we're doing toward embracing this way of healing our world and being connected with each other, that these are some resources that are useful, and your book is useful in that way. And I want to thank you again, and I want to thank our studio audience, and I want to thank you watching from your televisions at home very much for joining us this evening. I'm Walter Locke, here in Studio A at Arlington Community Media, saying good night.
Good.